Okay. But yeah, okay, so we are gonna get rolling here. I am Kate Wildman. I work in AWS security on our customer audit program. I lead up a team that works directly with our customers, helping them to attest to AWS's security controls in the cloud. I work really closely with our SOC and our ISO and PCI teams. I'm assuming since you're at an audit session, you're probably familiar with our external reports. And I work with customers directly to help make sure that they're being interpreted and used appropriately, and to get additional assurances that might not be in our reports.
And hi, I'm Brian Wagner. I'm head of compliance for financial services in EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, Africa. So my job is to help customers get comfortable with AWS as their cloud provider for moving regulated or super sensitive, at least, workloads into the cloud. So it's really about helping them establish trust and confidence in the AWS platform. And I work very closely with Kate and her team to do exactly that.
So before we kind of go over the agenda today, I wanted to give you guys an idea of what you're in for during this session. We'll be talking a little bit about how to understand if you are in a regulated field, or if you have a board or a board of governors who are super interested in making sure that if you are considering the cloud or considering AWS for workloads, that you understand the risk of what you're getting yourself into. We're going to go through a little bit about the resources that we make available and some of the different teams we make available to you as customers at AWS to understand what we do in terms of security for the controls that you no longer own when you're moving your workloads to the cloud. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have at least a 10,000-foot overview of how to better utilize our resources to get this kind of assurance, or at least an understanding of who to talk to in the future should these issues ever come up for you.
And we hope you're going to laugh and cry and all sorts of emotions at this 8 a.m. session about due diligence.
We hope that we are the most enthusiastic audit resources at AWS you will ever interact with. That's my main goal for this session. We'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons that our customers need to perform due diligence. Hopefully some of these will resonate with you. If you can see yourself in that position, you have definitely come to the right session. We'll talk a little bit about our experience with customers performing audits and due diligence of the cloud, and some of what that cycle might look like if you distill that down to a series of methodical steps. We'll talk about how you can prep your own institution to get ready to perform due diligence of AWS as your cloud service provider or as one of your cloud service providers. Talk about what it looks like to build a framework for assessing your cloud service provider, and then what it looks like to use some of our resources that are available to evaluate what kind of control coverage we offer to you as our customers. And then we'll talk a little bit about our experiences with some of our customers in performing this successfully.
I thought we were just going to read our SOC reports line by line to everybody this week in a very flat, monotone voice.
I don't think I could do anything monotone, but I'll try.
All right, I guess we'll make
Maybe if we have time at the end,
we'll make it a little more interesting.
Print them all 200 pages and go through that.
So why due diligence? Why are you here today, right? So with the silent disco thing, which kind of freaks me out as far as there's no audible feedback, but it sounds like everyone's nodding and listening to what I'm saying. But why are you here today? And that's rhetorical. Please don't start shouting out. But this is what I see in the field, what Kate sees out, and when we work with customers. Legislation comes up a lot. Customers get regulatory pressure sometimes to understand, to be more understanding of what AWS does for them or on their behalf. Another one is sort of commercial leverage. You say, well, we want a relationship with AWS, but our board or our directors, our executive office, or just yourselves need to gain more confidence in AWS before you move some of those sensitive workloads into the cloud. Also, evolving risk appetite. What we're going to see a little bit later is this is an iterative process. It's not about beginning, middle, end, and then we're done. Your risk position will change as you evolve, and you evolve, expand your use of the cloud. Ours could change. The environment, risk position could change when quantum computing comes out, and we have to everyone has to rethink how they do encryption, for example. These are all things that will sort of trigger this due diligence exercise, and it is something, like I say, it's cyclical. Also, does anyone issue or give to their vendors of any sort a questionnaire, a due diligence questionnaire? All right, we got the right people in the room. Also, this is very common for us, and these are things that we can address and respond to. Sometimes they're sort of written generically, and we have to do a little bit of interpretation. And part of what I do, and part of what Kate does, but my team sees these all the time, and we help customers sort of understand what they're really asking for. For example, I had one financial services customer give me a due diligence questionnaire that asked how we protected our gold bullion stores, and I had to inform them we don't actually have gold bullion stores. We are a cloud provider. So some of those things get sort of lost in translation, but they do have these blanket forms that we help out. But that's all part of the due diligence process, and we are friendly to those sorts of things. So we went over some of these. I think so. Regulatory pressure. So I work in Europe, Middle East, Africa. From a regulatory standpoint, this is generally the barrier for entry for a lot of our regulated customers, which is. It's not really, what we normally, our talk track about AWS adoption is try a little bit. Try here, try there, get good at it, and then ramp up your usage, and so on and so forth. And that's still very good advice, and not every workload is regulated, right? It doesn't mean you have to start with something and go to the regulator and say, here's all the PII I'm putting in the cloud, and we hope it works. But a lot of times customers might say, look, I understand that there's time and there's money to invest and there's resources I need to train and things like that. But to take that first leap, they might need to get some kind of understanding of AWS first. And that's, again, perfectly reasonable.
And then you sometimes get the boomerangs thrown at you where GDPR might come out, and maybe you aren't a regulated entity, but you definitely have regulated customers. So we get questions all the time about, how do the European Union Banking Authority requirements affect me as a U.S. service provider with European banking customers? Or how does GDPR, are you guys compliant with GDPR? Do we have an audit for that? So we get a lot of those kinds of questions.
And expansion of workloads into other markets. So the one thing that the cloud across industries has enabled for customers globally is the ability to be global in minutes. Today you might run a shop for whatever region that you're from, and you decide that you want to service customers in a completely other side of the world. You can do that. But of course, other side of the world, those customers, they might have different regulations, laws, or something that you need to dive deeper on to understand more about AWS from that perspective. And then, of course, your own risk appetite, right? It doesn't always have to be from regulators. You might even be working in industries that aren't regulated. That's completely fine. That's, what we'll learn here today is we're trying to provide that transparency for you regardless of the cause. But for those of you who are here at 8 a.m., I hope you all have some reasons to be here, and you have some reasons to get some due diligence done on AWS. So it's hard, though.
It's very hard.
How do you do it at Hyperscale? If you've been at literally any session that probably in the GRC track yesterday or today, we talk about how ubiquitous our environment is, right? So our regions in wherever part of the world, we operate them the same way at sort of the high level. Each region might have different implementation of certain things. For example, seismic activity is more of a concern in Japan than it is for US East. So there's different sort of ways to compensate for the environmental risk. But the challenge of that is we're hyperscale. Like we've launched, we're at 21 regions now. Like it's insane. How do you do due diligence on all these regions, or just the regions you want? Even when you do, where do you start? It's a big challenge to tackle.
And we have customers who are using a variety of our services. So some of our customers limit their use of services to those that we include in the scope of our SOC reports. But how do you get assurance of the controls that are happening for those services that are not included in scope of our external compliance reports? How can you get one-on-one attention with AWS when we serve a number of customers around the entire globe? And for us, it's difficult too, because we want to provide those kinds of assurances to customers, but we can't hire a team of 100,000 people to meet one-on-one with 100,000 customers. So what we rely on is developing mechanisms that can help scale audit engagement with customers. And some of those mechanisms we include our audit reports. Brian, you want to talk a little about Artifact?
Yeah, so AWS Artifact, this is actually, we try to throw technology at a lot of challenges customers face, and due diligence is not something you can just sort of API away. However, there actually is an API for due diligence in this case, or at least your baseline due diligence, which is AWS Artifact. So we have over 50, I believe, artifacts currently in AWS Artifact.
We have over 60 alignments
60,
and reports.
60 is higher than 50, so we do have over 50. We also have over 3. We have at least 3, somewhere between 3 and like 1,000 in there at any given time. But what it really means to you is, so this like smattering of audit and compliance frameworks and things like that, these are actually available to you as customers right in AWS. So if you have an AWS account, you can go to Artifact. It's one of our services. If you don't have an AWS account, you should get one and then go to Artifact. It doesn't cost money. It is our gift to you from a transparency point of view, and it allows you to consume our third-party assurance of these attestations.
But we know that there's challenges with that too. If you haven't gotten your risk profile or your risk framework in terms of assessing the cloud into the spot it needs to be, it can be difficult to understand where to start with these reports. We make a lot available. If you ever go to aws.amazon.com/compliance, you'll see an ever-growing list of alignments and attestations that we make globally. And I know keenly from being on the other side of the house how difficult it is to figure out where to start and how to leverage those. Can I leverage those in terms of scope? Are all of your regions scoped into these reports? If I'm using something in US East, can I use one of your EU reports to get attestation of controls? How do I perform a mapping to a certification when I don't have the framework that certification is mapped to? And what if I need to go to a data center? How do I know for sure what kinds of attestations are being done to make sure that the video cameras are in the right place, let alone that your access is being managed appropriately? Sometimes when you're under the gun, I know how difficult it can be to get the specific attestation that you need in the immediate term. And so that's a little bit what we're hoping to talk about today, is to arm you with tools to get assurance quickly, given some of the reports and other mechanisms that we make available to scale some of that attestation engagement with customers.
And since there's about 100 of you here right now, this is the part where I was going to read SOC. Right? Instead of each of you individually doing it, we'll just read it here. That's a scalable mechanism, right? No. So the shared responsibility model, surely you've seen this before. I hope you've seen this before. I hope it's in every single presentation here at this conference. And there's a reason for that. It is, we're not trying to burn this into your mind, although that wouldn't hurt. It really doesn't hurt. It's burned into mine. I don't feel any pain. No, but the point is, this is really foundational. This addresses questions that I get from customers like, hey, AWS, what is your resiliency? What is your plans for resiliency and disaster recovery? And my question right back at them is, what is your plan for resiliency and disaster recovery? We operate our regions, again, ubiquitously. Right? We have this hyperscale cloud available in an always-on fashion. We don't turn off data centers and we don't turn off regions and just to see what happens. Actually, you can do that as customers. That's part of this shared responsibility model. Yes, we have redundancy built in. We have our story around availability at the physical infrastructure level, but you as customers are responsible for using that in a way to meet your own requirements. So that's why shared responsibility in this case is so important. But what we're talking about here in context is this side. If you came to my session yesterday, I talked a lot about your side as customers, about what you can do and how you can build your own controls according to your own risks and stuff like that. But that is absolutely foundational upon our cloud. So this is really, we want to talk about the transparency and understanding this side of shared responsibility today.
So what does that look like in practice? The kind of questions that our reports and our attestations and the resources we're going to go through align to are questions like, what does AWS do at a host level in terms of vulnerability scanning? How are access permissions across AWS service teams managed in terms of our hypervisor? How does AWS conduct penetration testing to make sure that known vulnerabilities or common vulnerabilities are being tested? Or how is application security being applied in terms of common threat profiling? So
if you're in the risk business, if you will, those are questions that you probably are asking your own organization. So how do we as an organization manage threats? How do we as an organization manage patching? But when you're using AWS, and we do get into this shared responsibility, still a valid question. Those questions still exist. But now we have it on two sides of the house. How is AWS doing it, and how are we as customers doing it? And that's ultimately what's going to end up reporting up to all the people, whoever makes those decisions, as far as risk acceptance and how, quantifying risk, things like that. Those questions are important for both sides of shared responsibility, really. In this slide, I imagine like Lion King and like the circle of life, but because of course we can't do that for image rights. I see people taking pictures. I'm gonna stand here like this. Go ahead if you want to take a couple of pictures. This is the cycle of due diligence. I should have brought like a little stuffed animal. No, but like I said before, due diligence is not, there's not a beginning, middle, end necessarily. The individual, after I left, they're all taking pictures. Like there's no way we're getting a photo of this guy. No, seriously though. This is something that happens in cycles, or it should. It would be great if we could just say we do we do our due diligence and then that's that, right? But like we said before, sometimes things change. So planning has to happen. What are we going to do? What is what are the scope of our due diligence? What do we need to focus on? Build a framework. That is incredibly important. Look for GRC310. That was my session yesterday about building your control framework. Make that specific to yourself, but more importantly, specific to the risks that you as customers are going to face individually to your business. Then get your coverage together, like understand what you're going to do about your due diligence. If you remember the slide with all the different frameworks and things like that, there's a lot of stuff that we attest to. And all of that stuff is, of course, it's relevant to you. But again, you need to figure out who your stakeholders are. You have to focus on the scope of your due diligence on AWS as it directly applies to the risks that you're going to face. What are you using AWS to do? Are you putting PII in there? Are you exposing things to the public internet? There's different things you have to figure out. Are you using services like EC2 where you have control over the operating system, or are you using our high-level services where you don't have control over the operating system? The due diligence is going to depend on the context of what you're doing with the cloud. And then write and share the report. I can't tell you, especially at large organizations, how many times we get interactions from various parts of the business, or various parts of the world, asking the same exact questions. Now, that's not a bad thing. That means these are, you have a risk-minded approach to the cloud, and that's exactly what we encourage you to do. But also, don't forget to share the report. You can benefit. We talk about mechanisms for scale. Your entire organization can benefit from the right due diligence. That's why it's so important, and we'll talk about stakeholders in a little bit. But it's so important to get everybody's perspective. It's so easy to go in as a line of business owner and say, look, I need to focus on these 7 things, but you don't realize in your organization there's other challenges, concerns, or things that they want to cover in a due diligence exercise. So as you do these cycles, it's so important to get that perspective. And then, of course, lastly, mitigate and monitor. Right? Figure out the output of that. It's not just a tick box exercise. Actually, put that into action. Decide what the due diligence on AWS means to you, and that's where you start using our awesome tools and services to further mitigate any risks that you perceive.
I think also an important concept here is do it over again and again.
Good point.
And again and again. I get heartburn when I speak with customers and then I don't see them again for 2 or 3 years, and they come back and that's the second time that they've ever performed evaluation of their use of the cloud from a risk profile perspective. We've changed in that time. I can bet that your institution has changed at that time. And we've certainly published dozens of reports in that period as well. Yeah. So we're going to go into each of these each of these stages of the cycle of due diligence in a little more detail.
And risk, it's all about risk, right? And risk is a limit. Risk never hits zero. There is no such thing as zero risk. It doesn't in the world. It doesn't. I could, even if I stayed home all day, I could still get hurt. Like it doesn't. Leaving, flying on airplanes, it doesn't change risk. So I guess the point of my point here is repeating this exercise. That the closer you as a customer can bring your risk to that zero line, and if anyone's into math like I am, if you can tell with the glasses. The closer you get to zero, the better. So that iterative process, that year over year, or however frequent you need to do it, continuously will bring that line closer to zero for you. planning your due diligence. Is that me? Is that why you're looking at me? Yeah, it is. Planning your due diligence. So this, in terms of how Kate and I work on a regular basis, I would say almost daily basis, this is very much planning. I do so much planning with customers, and so does Kate, to be fair, on how to do it. So it might not look the same as due diligence that you've done on your vendors, your infrastructure providers, whatever, or even your current providers today. It looks a little bit different. We can help. We can absolutely help out. But number one is going to be identify stakeholders. I mentioned it before. It's that perspective. You need that perspective from everybody involved to get the most out of your exercise, your due diligence exercise on AWS. And we try to make it fun, as you can see. But it's definitely an effort, and you have to take seriously. And getting these people out in front is so important to your due diligence.
I don't know if this would sound familiar or resonate with any of you, but I recently was involved in some conversations with the customer across 5 different teams of their business, and they didn't know that all of those teams were talking to AWS about security. I was involved with a real estate team who was used to building their own on-prem data centers, and a cloud governance team that was working on creating their framework for assessment of the cloud. Another team was their development team, who needed to understand how we were performing change management in accordance with how they were performing their DevOps cycle. And finally, I had to get all these people in a room together and say, you are all asking me the exact same questions.
Yeah.
Let's think about how to build a governance framework for your institution that will help you align with that a little closer.
And it may be surprising. I mean, I don't intend to just read bullet by bullet. I mean, I'm not going to insult everyone's intelligence there. But the 4th one down, audit report consumers. That's an interesting one. We sort of learned that over time. Who's going to read this, right? Ultimately, there's going to be some sort of output. Is it a report or a measurement, whatever it is, however you do it at your organization. But who consumes that report is a very important perspective to have, because what are we doing? Is it a tick box exercise? You take that report and you file it away and no one sees it? No, we actually encourage you to show that around, and so understanding what the consumers are going to get from that due diligence exercise is going to be extremely important context to have, because you end up writing something that nobody wants.
And I think this is important for 2 reasons. First off, every audit and every due diligence exercise can't happen without a scope. And it's hard to determine a successful exercise of assessing the cloud if you're not sure what your scope of risk actually is. If you're not sure what workloads might be planned across your business, or what kind of internal audit requirements are responsible for your third-party IT vendors. If your application security teams aren't fully pulled in from assessing a third party, and especially if you're regulated, if you're not taking into consideration all of your regulators' expectations as well. God forbid you do an exercise and realize that you've missed a service or you've missed a potential workload that's planned for the next year, that you're going to have to do a whole nother exercise to scope in. Not only does this make sure that you're communicating appropriately with AWS during this exercise, but also that all of your stakeholders who might consume your report are identified before you determine the scope of what you need to take a look at. You also have some additional stakeholders involved in this process, and that's AWS. We have lots of different teams across our business that are required in some cases, or just available in others, to help our customers with this process. We definitely don't require our customers to scope on their own, or identify stakeholders on their own, or even evaluate coverage on their own. A couple of these stakeholders, I also won't insult your intelligence by listing them all out, but your account team is your first line of contact in making sure that you are getting the engagement that you need and the resources you need. If you forget anything that we've told you today, you can at least know that your account team is equipped to be a partner for you in this exercise and pull in some of these additional experts. We have a whole host of teams of security solutions architects who are deeply schooled in how we do things at AWS and how to translate that to you and your use of our cloud services. If you're involved in enterprise support, they also are equipped to provide you additional support in real time, and sometimes in near real time for these kinds of questions. And we also have teams across our business of compliance leads, people like Brian, whose sole job is to sit with customers and help them with these kinds of exercises. People like my team, who work in security and engage with customers. Your account teams and your enterprise support teams should be equipped to engage us and to know when to engage us, but we have many different functions across AWS who are dedicated to helping you get the attestation and assurance you need while you're doing this process.
And if you do operate in Europe, Middle East, Africa, we'll probably meet at some point anyway.
And the also unsung heroes here are control owners. We do talk very frequently about how, if you've ever attended reInvent, we preach how security is job zero at AWS. And that's not just something that's preached, it's really ingrained in our culture. If you've ever been involved with security at AWS, you will know that risk is decentralized across our business, and that's intentional. We make sure that every entity is responsible across each business unit for owning controls, reporting controls to our risk function centrally, and making sure that we're operating effectively. So if you've ever evaluated a single control of AWS, you are also unknowingly interacting in the background with a whole host of hundreds of control owners across our business.
And put that in context, I did have a questionnaire I was helping a customer fill out, and one of the questions was, who at AWS, it was like I was asking for a single answer, is responsible for like data security or something. It was something similar to that, and I said, and my answer was everybody, like every single person that works at AWS. There was some back and forth email, ended up on a phone call, and I explained to them exactly that. Like literally everybody is responsible for that level of security. We do not centralize the risk. But anyway, I digress. Preparation, prepared to evaluate. I guess this really, from my perspective, this comes from an anti-pattern of, hi, we need due diligence, we need it done tomorrow. We need you to send us all of your internal documentation that's super sensitive that you've built over the years. Just send it to an email is fine. I expect it in 24 hours. That's not a great way to do this exercise. That sounds very much like a tick box exercise. We encourage you deeply to really give this a lot of thought. Because again, we do things a little bit differently. We like to think we do things measurably better, I would say, from this perspective. So it's so important to understand how this all works and how this all fits together. And that's what the people from the stakeholder slide, we can help you figure all that out and figure out what's important to you. But starting early, that's number one. These kind of like due diligence shouldn't sneak up on you. Unless you're really kind of ignoring any signals coming from, if you're regulated, what's the regulator going to say? Don't wait to the last minute, I guess. Please don't. This is, we have time constraints. We have, these things take some time to educate, especially someone in your organization that might be responsible for accepting risk. To start from zero, people that maybe don't even know what AWS stands for, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing, but it takes time. Let's start early. Identifying stakeholders across the business, we figured that out already, but that might take longer than a day. That might take some understanding. Bring everybody in a room. If you operate sort of in a silo fashion, you might have to actually meet some people first in your own organization to talk about.
God forbid.
Yeah, I know. You actually have to sit together and meet. That kind of thing takes time. You have to establish those relationships. You have to sit at the table, and then especially for people that don't normally talk to each other in that example, you have to agree on what we're going to be doing there in the first place. So this kind of thing takes some time. Aligning with a governance function and risk appetite. This kind of goes back to what is it that you're doing with the cloud? What is it that you need out of AWS? How can we help? Right? We help millions of customers today do whatever it is that they do and launch very successful businesses, among other things. What are you trying to do with the cloud, and what does that mean to your risk position? Are you putting PII in the cloud? Is that PII from Europe and you're subject to GDPR? There's so many things you need to consider, so you have to really, like I say, think about what you're using the cloud for. Vetting your understanding of the AWS Shared Responsibility model. So important. That really lends itself well to scoping, because there might be some cases in your risk framework or your control framework that you say, well, actually, me as a customer, I can do all this stuff. I know what I have to do over here, and we can just focus on what we need from AWS on this side of the house. In identifying existing assessment frameworks. So this is also very helpful. This actually will speed things up. As I said, this stuff takes time, but if you can align to like a NIST, a CSA, some sort of external standard to your own environment, or maybe you're using those, maybe you've adopted those into your own environment anyway, but normalizing that is super helpful, because we even have our own forward-facing mappings and alignments on how you can use services to actually cover off NIST controls, for example. But it's a great way to tick some things off, cross some things off. You say, all right, here's my entire risk outlook, and you can use these you can use these existing third-party frameworks to say, okay, I'm cool over here. I don't need to, my vulnerability management is strong, but I do need to know about AWS's, and you can tick some things off straight away just by aligning to those frameworks.
I think the other side of that as well is making sure that we're going to talk in a minute about inventorying the scope of your existing requirements. And I think also identifying what potential existing frameworks at your own institution that you're using, maybe a third-party vendor assessment, IT risk assessment, internal audit requirements, regulatory framework, all of those are equally important here as well.
So let's build an assessment framework. Literally right here, right now. Get your pens out. So we saw this before. This is absolutely where you start. This is the baseline, ground zero. Please, before you send me an email or call me to help you out, please at least prepare to lie to me that you've read the SOC report. I accept lies. That's close enough. But at least that you know that they exist. Right, you don't have to memorize it. That's okay, but that's a great place to start. And I know if you've been here doing the GRC track up to this point, you'll hear we use SOC a lot. SOC is very helpful. It's global. It's our own attestation. But don't ignore the other ones. Even in the case of, let's say you're not subject to PCI. Like PCI is another global one, right, for payment card industry. Well, maybe you're not in the payment card industry, but we attest to our PCI alignment, and there might be some really cool controls in PCI that are directly relevant to your risk. So don't ignore those. Don't put the blinders on. Now, I mean, it's tough to consume 60 plus, as I remember in Artifact. It's really, you don't have to consume 60 plus artifacts, but like I say, don't necessarily ignore. I think like another good one is US-based standards that from my European customers, they might. European regions might not be in scope, but the controls that we attest to over there are really, really helpful to get perspective and get context about addressing your own risk requirements. And surely this is not the first time you're seeing the shared responsibility model, but this is we're hammering this in, right? So this is you might, for example, up here, you might look at our attestations and you might be focused on the way we do network segregation. Like that's something that you have control of in your VPCs if you're using VPCs, but you might have to take the lens on AWS and say, well, I need to understand how you're doing network segregation because we're using services outside of VPC. We're using things like S3 and KMS and other services like that. But it's really, so take those, so we're going to combine a few things, right? Take those attestations and audit reports that we give you straight away, look at shared responsibility model, use those third-party frameworks to start ticking off that stuff, and also circling sort of the things that you need to focus on.
Next step in this process is to think about aligning to the AWS Control Environment. It can be really difficult sometimes to think of the nuances in the shared responsibility model. We've got lots of people available to help you along the way, but something that's helpful is to think about the controls that we operate ourselves. We do a similar exercise that we've been talking about in the terms of how we attest to our own security to our third-party auditors. We start with our full scope of internal requirements. So our internal audit requirements, our baseline security standards that we have across all of our service teams and our own internal non-service teams. We then think about all of the audit frameworks that we attest to and include those in our common control framework. We then think about controls that our customers have requested as well and loop those in. You often see those cycle over cycle in our SOC report. We distill all of those down to a common control framework, probably similar to how many of you operate CCFs at your own institution. They boil down to these 13 control domains. So if you ever work with my team or Brian's team, we're probably harping on you about, oh, the control you're thinking about falls under development and configuration management, or, oh, you're worried about business continuity and resiliency or contingency planning. We talk through this and can help you align your own framework to any of our own internal framework as well. It's helpful in this context to think about where a shared responsibility might lie or a partial responsibility, where your responsibility is, where ours is, and it kind of gives a good common language, so to speak, to use when you're interacting on some of these more gray area topics with AWS and our reports. That also brings me to calling in the experts. A lot of times you can get stuck. You get some tricky controls you're not totally sure whether or not apply to our environment or not. Or you've got gold bullion in a framework that you need to attest to, and you're not totally sure how to write that is not applicable. But
I keep it at my desk, by the way. I keep all the gold bullion under my desk. It's in a bag. It's like zipped, so you really can't see.
That is not an attestation. We have teams who are available to help you in this process, either from starting from scratch, if you're starting to build a framework and you don't have the resourcing internally or the time internally to get this done, or if you have a first pass and you want someone to vet it before you start going through this process yourself. I'll talk about compliance briefings towards the end of this presentation, but a really good resource that is available at any time is AWS Professional Services. I think typically customers think about ProServe, as we call them, as the helpers who can help you architect if you're trying to architect for security or use our services in a certain manner. But we also have GRC experts in ProServe who are equipped to help you build frameworks or to attest to your own due diligence of the cloud. They can do certain things like help you understand the nuances in their shared responsibility model if you're having trouble with that. If you don't have a cloud governance function, and some of what I was talking about earlier of multiple teams being interested in performing due diligence without a single centralized risk function, they can help you conceptualize some strategy around how to create a governance function at your institution. If you have acquired a new business and your risk profile has drastically changed and you're not totally sure what that looks like in the context of the cloud, ProServe is equipped to help. And if the thought of having to spend time mapping to our 60 plus reports makes you want to quit your job as an auditor and go and change industries, you can also offload all of that to ProServe as well if you want. So putting this all together, what are some practical steps of what it actually looks like to build a framework from square one? I'll just kind of summarize some of what we just talked about, but start with inventorying all that you do currently at your company, all of your existing requirements. Put those honestly into Excel or into whatever Archer or GRC equivalent that you're using. Pull in your regulatory requirements. Pull in any additional risk profiles that you can think of in terms of defining risks, and to actually define those risks out. I love seeing frameworks that have considered a risk and associated controls, and then requirements that are required for those controls.
She really does love seeing it. She's a hit at parties.
I will pop the champagne if I see someone who is assessing us in that manner. Nothing worse than getting just a rote list of requests. Do you do this? It just breaks my heart. But if I see you thinking about, okay, maybe I have a risk of an AWS employee inadvertently accessing my account. Is that possible? And then thinking about controls that you might want to expect are in place and requirements that you want to require of your cloud service provider, even agnostic to AWS. You're setting yourself up to actually perform a meaningful due diligence exercise. Inventory all those requirements. Think about it in the shared responsibility model and cross those babies off. If you know that something solidly sits on your side, don't even include it at the moment. You can write either some sort of narrative around why it doesn't apply, because obviously we love to document, that's important, but you can keep those out of scope. Consider the full scope of the services you're using and the services that you are planning to use in between the current point of assessment and your next future plan of assessment. And make sure that you're vetting all of those with the stakeholders that we talked about so that you're not missing anything during this exercise. Obviously, we're describing our control objectives in accordance with those risks, and we're aligning it to what AWS is doing. We can help you align to our control framework. We have resources available to do that, which we'll go over in a second. That's the point where we move into coverage. Think about your risk appetite. Think about what we currently have. If you are comfortable with the way that your institution is covering controls or compensating controls that you've put in place to mitigate certain risks in the cloud, you can document those and keep those out of scope for when you're evaluating additional coverage in the future. And then also think about those additional asks. Get creative at this point. I know creative and audit doesn't always go together. I certainly think you can creatively audit. I like to think that I am a creative auditor.
Very creative.
But think about, in terms of those risks, what additional requirements you might need to ask of your cloud service provider, even if it's not AWS. Assurances that you need to understand that may or may not fall within the scope of a SOC report, that may fall into the scope of another report. We can help you determine. In the spirit of innovation when it comes to audit, maybe we could release our SOC reports on audiobook format. Would anyone buy that? Some of these things are capacity management. There are certain regional programs that I can talk about in a second that include a lot of controls about how we are managing capacity that might not appear in our SOC report. And obviously, our customers love to start with the SOC report because it's the flashy one, the fun sister, so to speak.
Yes.
Or bug bounties. We have a lot of public documentation about how we're part of the bug bounty program, but we don't necessarily have an audit control that attests to that. I love seeing customers think about some of the other things that they want their cloud service provider to do and include that in the due diligence framework. Before I move on to how you actually move to evaluating that coverage, just having one summary slide you can take a picture of. Before you move on to reading those reports or having someone else on your team read those reports or hiring ProServe to read those reports for you, these are the checklists that you need to make sure are done before you start thinking about coverage. Have you inventoried your frameworks? Have you identified all of your requirements? Have you found your risk appetite and all the stakeholders who are included? I know we keep preaching stakeholders, but you'd be surprised at how difficult that one hurdle is in terms of getting this done quickly. And then also, have you included both risks and controls? We're auditors, we know risk and controls. They hardly ever appear in the frameworks, and that is important to make sure this is a meaningful, ongoing exercise. Okay. Now we're ready to evaluate after all of that prep. And we have a lot of resources available to you to help you. Obviously, we've talked about Artifact, but if you haven't ever accessed AWS Artifact, free service you can get through your console. Go to, just search for Artifact in the search bar of aws.amazon.com. You'll get to it. We make all of those reports available regardless of what industry you're operating in. I know we keep kind of preaching financial services. Brian's in the FinServ space, but if you're a healthcare organization or an automotive industry, or you're operating in energy or telco, we likely have a report or at least an alignment that will map to it. You can go to aws.amazon.com/compliance for the full up-to-date list, updated weekly, of the alignments, attestations, and reports that we make available. And then you can cross-reference that in Artifact to see what kind of artifacts we have available to you. If you've ever downloaded a report in Artifact, you've probably seen this weird cover page with some paperclip items in Adobe. Most of our artifacts are comprised of 6 to 10 documents that will help you perform mappings or attest to certain controls for your industry and kind of act as a workbook for you. I also wanted to mention here, we've talked about our control environment. We on the audit team do things centrally. We manage all of our controls as an enterprise, not service by service. That's often something difficult to talk about in the context of the cloud, because I think for traditional SaaS or infrastructure services, you're thinking about a service by service type of attestation. Our SOC report, we add services to scope because all of our service teams manage their controls the same way.
Hey, great job.
Our change management, for example, is centralized. Every single service team, whether they're in scope of any of our compliance reports, has to go through the same development cycle. So all of our dev controls apply to every service team. If we are, another fun fact that we've made available for customers is that if we are attesting to a regional audit report, we scope in all of our global infrastructure unless it explicitly says otherwise on the cert or on the report that you're reading. PCI, for example, is a good one. Although that's a US-based cert, we scope in our entire global infrastructure. So even if you are a non-financial services customer operating in APAC, you can still take advantage of the scope of that report because whatever infrastructure you're running, regardless of where you are in the AWS cloud, attest to those same controls because we manage it all centrally. I often see this realization happen to customers when they realize, oh, actually, I have 50 reports available to me. C5, for example, is a German audit report. I don't operate in Germany. Well, I've scoped our entire global infrastructure into that report, and if you're using the services that are in scope, you are running on the same infrastructure, you're using the same services, and every single one of those controls apply to your use of the cloud. So you have a lot of options available to you in terms of our global audit reports. We also are constantly publishing service documentation. If you are curious about what a specific service that you're using might do or might not do in terms of technical alignment, how they can help support your audits, themselves, your workloads. We definitely have compliance documentation for our services as well as technical documentation for our services. I often find customers are surprised that they can use a lot of our documentation as artifacts during their own audit or their own alignments. If you go to aws.amazon.com/documentation, you will find hundreds of thousands of pages of service-specific documents that can align to the controls that are included in your framework.
And Monday, we just launched our first group of services. There's 37 services that we've just launched. What you can do as customers from a security standpoint. So like S3, what can I do to encrypt? What are my capabilities for access management, things like that. It's right in our documentation. That used to be sort of conversations we'd have with customers one-on-one, but now we're actually embedding security best practices as part of our documentation, and we've got 37 available as of Monday, and we're growing that every single day. So use that as well.
We often get questions about our data centers. I hope that it's evident that we don't let anyone into our data centers who are not AWS employees, because we want to keep your data secure if you are using the AWS cloud. But we also understand that you need attestation of what's happening in the data centers that you cannot access. On our audit team, those 60 reports that we publish annually means that we have external auditors in our data centers globally every single day of the year, just about. And we also try to make our controls available to you to review as well. You can rest assured, if you spend any amount of time going through the reports on Artifact, if you pay attention to the review cycles of each of those reports, it's pretty easy to figure out how frequently we have third-party auditors checking that we have CCTV cameras and that our SOC is responding to alarms and that alarms are actually happening on each of our doors. Whoops. But we also make our controls available to you. We most recently, a couple months ago, published our global infrastructure interactive map. This gives you a really clear understanding of how our transit backbone is working, how our regions and availability zones are organized, how our infrastructure aligns to resiliency controls. There's a lot of good. Oh, go ahead.
No, has anyone not seen these graphics before? If you've not seen them yet, so infrastructure.aws. So we have a TLD now. We have an AWS TLD. Infrastructure.aws. This comes to life, and it's not just theater. Like it's very cool looking. Don't get me wrong. The UI designers were fantastic, but it's super informative, and it really helps you visualize. I mean, the cloud is not this amorphous blob. It is it is data centers. There's physical infrastructure. Infrastructure.aws. The next few slides you're going to see screenshots from that. So if that doesn't look familiar, please visit that today. It's phenomenal.
And I was going to say, I worked very closely with our infra team to document a lot of the text that you see as you start clicking through. These are things that are either coming directly from our reports or additional language around what specifically we're doing. We know a lot of customers are concerned about global resiliency, for example. We've included a lot of language that can be copied and pasted, wink wink, into a lot of physical security or resiliency type of controls in a due diligence framework that can really help you paint a clearer picture for your stakeholders about what we are doing to secure our global infrastructure, and as well as how our availability zone operates for resiliency globally. I also wrote a lot of text. If you've ever seen our data center website, we actually have a full section in there called Our Employees, Our People, Our Controls, Our Data Centers, that gives you an overview of how we build and how we vet our data centers, availability zones, and regions, as well as an excerpt from our common control framework and the physical security and business continuity portions of our framework about what we're doing to secure and operate our data centers globally. These are also great copy-paste resources if you are completing physical security or business continuity or disaster recovery portions of an attestment. We also have currently more than 50 security white papers, guidebooks, mappings. We have those teams of people that I talked about recently, or a couple slides back, who are dedicated only to helping customers attest to what AWS is doing in the cloud, are constantly publishing resources to help you. A really great example is our approach to operational resiliency. Resiliency is kind of a hot topic right these days. That includes additional resources that are clipped to the PDFs of mappings to our current attested controls, if that's something that you need to do yourself. If you need to understand how to audit AWS in more depth, we've got a white paper for that. Our risk and compliance white paper is updated every 2 years as well. There's a wealth of resources there that probably have additional resources attached to them and will actually probably help you get a mapping completed in maybe even 3 days.
That's not an SLA, by the way.
No, it's not. As long as you have your stakeholders in place.
Right.
We also have recently published the AWS Auditor Learning Path and are going to continue to build that out as well. This is currently geared towards external assessors like a PwC or a Deloitte who might be assessing our customers' use of AWS to educate them about a lot of what we just talked through. Our auditors, I'm sure your auditors, it's a tough conversation about what does or does not apply. How does the shared responsibility model work? Your poor auditors have the fun challenge of assessing you and assessing AWS. And that can be a really hard challenge, especially in communicating during an audit with your auditors. We do have trainings now available for external audit firms to audit customers and AWS concurrently. And we're continuing to build this out for customers who need to audit AWS themselves as well, with training, resources, and additional information about what that cycle looks like and how to do that successfully. Finally, a really great resource if you are stuck, kind of like ProServe, but you don't necessarily want to go through a compliance engagement, is compliance briefings. Show of hands, has anyone ever gone through a compliance briefing with AWS in the past? Oh, I wish I saw every hand up.
You don't know what you're missing.
You don't know what you're missing. If you've ever thought, wow, I really wish I could sit with somebody at AWS and have them help me with security, this is your free mechanism to do that.
That's right.
Most of your account teams, those security solutions architects I talked about, their full job is to sit with customers and do engagements. You can request a compliance briefing on an annual basis, a quarterly basis, a monthly basis, however frequently you want, and you set the agenda.
Daily basis.
No, don't do daily basis. Yes, I guess you could if you wanted to. We'd have to hire more people. But we can cover topics however you'd like to. If you want to vet your framework with somebody, but you don't necessarily need to go through a whole engagement, if you are completely lost in terms of how do I approach vulnerability management in the cloud and of the cloud, they can help you. If you are so adverse to reading a 200-page SOC report, they've read it and they've read all the other ones as well and can even talk you through what's changed every 6 months when we publish our reports.
And currently crafting interpretive dance routine to describe it as well.
Exactly. And they probably have access to language for you if you're just not sure how to summarize a narrative to your board of directors about something we're doing, or you've got a blank space in your framework and you're not totally sure what to fill it with. They probably know. So if you can talk to your account team, your enterprise support team at any point in time to request compliance briefings, and they will connect you with the right people. Maybe even Brian.
It might even be me if you're lucky.
Maybe even me.
And another really valuable output from a compliance briefing and your ability to input to that as well is if you look at some of our audit reports, SOC in particular, they're written at a very intentional level of depth. And you might need some more context around that, right? So I get it, and I get that it works, but what does that really mean on the inside? So those are the kind of things you can get out. It's really helpful, and that could be part of that scoping exercise. That compliance briefing might be the difference between you crossing that off your list and say, now I get it, and I'm okay with it. We can focus on something else and not. So it could really actually make less work for you if you do it right.
All right, what's next? You've evaluated your coverage. You've got narratives in your framework. You are confident that you've got the full scope. What should you do after that? I think obviously we're documenting this entire time. And Brian talked about it earlier. You got to share that report. A report's only valuable if someone's actually consuming it. I hope that your institutions view compliance as an enabler instead of one of those roll your eyes, check the box kind of things. I certainly think that compliance is a huge enabler in terms of allowing your institution to securely operate and continue to evolve your use of new technologies. I hope that those are being shared across not only your institution, but with any of your governing bodies. If you're regulated, with your regulators, if you have end users, with your customers, with all of the stakeholders, hopefully, that you have identified as part of this process. This will help really hammer home if you're having trouble with cloud governance at your institution, how best to create a governance framework and to continuously align your use of the cloud with your understanding of risk. You can, at this point, identify compensating controls, any kinds of mitigations that may be needed during an enterprise agreement negotiation with AWS. And also, documenting your clear rationale for when you undergo your own audits of what risks you've considered accepting and why. And keep doing it. Hopefully this is not a one-time exercise. I hope that this is a every 2 years, every year, ongoing kind of exercise for you to reevaluate what kind of new services and features you've adopted in the last year, what kind of workloads might be planned, what your dev teams are planning on expanding for the concurrent calendar year, and additionally how we have changed as an AWS institution as well, and what additional resources we may have made available to you to continuously refine your framework over the coming years.
So yeah, case studies, well, these are slightly, we have to anonymize these, unfortunately, but these are kind of real world scenarios, how customers have made some amazing gains on using the platform based on what we have available, everything that we've talked about today. So the quote, "It's amazing to me that security is so ingrained in your culture. I think that's AWS's main differentiator. Mostly what I've seen wouldn't be possible if it weren't truly embedded in the essence of your institution." That's a fantastic quote. What that really, what we hope you take away from that is that this exercise, like Kate said, it should be that AWS's rigor around our environment is actually an advantage for you from a competitive standpoint. That's actually probably why we can't even use the customer names here, is because their evaluation of AWS, their understanding of how we approach risk and how we manage risk in context of their business, is for them, that's an enabler. That actually, they say, wow, that's better than what we do now. We're actually, even if we did nothing, if we changed absolutely nothing about the way we do IT as a customer and simply put it in AWS, they would measurably lower their risk. I mean, that's a pretty profound thing that's not their statement, this is their statement, but that's really what that means. It says, let's do the homework, let's see what risks I'm facing today, let's see what risks I think I'm facing in the cloud, and go through a lot of these exercises. I mean, to get to that statement, to get the customer to that mindset, it was a journey, right? It takes some time and someone to hold all the stakes. We've been talking about the stakes and how many of them there are to hold. But it's so important to get that perspective to come to a statement like that. It's incredible.
And I also want to make this practical for you as well. So I'll give you two examples, one in financial services and one in healthcare, about a couple of customers that I think have done this whole cycle we've talked about really well. First off, in healthcare, I was working with a large healthcare institution who was one of those institutions that had about 4 or 5 different functions interested in the cloud. We had them start by inventorying all of their different requirements, and it was over 1,000. Obviously, that can be a lot of work for them. So they worked closely with professional services to scope that framework down, map it to our reports, and identify 12 main areas where they felt like they didn't have the right information. They went through a series of compliance briefings at this time, one at the beginning to help them inventory all of their different requirements, and one right before after they had identified those 12 areas to get additional information that may not have been available online to continue to flesh out that report. Their report to the board opened up about 3 new workloads that they didn't think they would be able to evaluate because they didn't have a clear understanding of risk across AWS's business. And the next year when they showed up to do it again, their whole cycle of due diligence only took them a week, which was, I think, a little staggering. The second is in financial services. We helped them in ProServe create a governance function. They missed that. They had 3 different infrastructure teams that were worried about their on-prem and their different multi-cloud environments and had no idea how to evaluate the physical security of AWS outside of some of the controls that we publish in our SOC report. Our teams, during a series of compliance briefings with them, were able to help them leverage reports they didn't know that they could leverage. That C5 report, for example, our Korean KISMS report, a couple of other more regional reports that they had just scoped out because they didn't think that the infrastructure applied. They hadn't realized was scoped to our global infrastructure. In that time, we were able to get them full coverage of all the controls that they identified without ever having to perform a specific audit of AWS, just through those compliance briefings. So I guess the main takeaways we've kind of summarized already are: start early, identify your stakeholders, and use what we have available, including compliance briefings, to give you an understanding of risk, and then keep doing it. All right.
Great. We hope you had some fun. More learning was probably the more important thing, but hopefully it was at least slightly fun. But thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be available in the back for questions.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
That's right.